of the late Bishop Ruben Lee Speaks. Bishop Speaks, for those of us who are Zionites and those who may not be Zionites, he was the 76th bishop in line of succession of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And he was indeed greatly known for his leadership and creative engagement in ministry. And we are excited tonight to welcome Dr. Melanie L Harris as our speaker for today. Dr. Melanie Harris currently serves as Director of Food, Health, and Ecological Program and Professor of Black Feminist and Womanist Theology at Wake Forest School of Divinity in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dr. Harris has served a variety of institutions in higher education. She earned her Ph.D. and MA degrees from Union Theological Seminary, an MDiv from Iliff School of Theology, and a BA from Spelman College. And she is also a graduate of the Harvard Leadership Program and former American Council of Education Fellow. Dr. Harris is indeed a community leader whose passion for education is linked and connected to her commitment to social justice. She has been awarded several prestigious awards and academic fellowships throughout her academic tenure. It is indeed, my brothers and sisters, an honor and a privilege at this time to welcome and introduce and present Dr. Melanie L Harris, our Bishop Ruben L Speaks Endowed Memorial Lecture. Good family, let's give her a warm welcome at this time.
Thank you so much. I certainly appreciate you. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Lawrence. Thank you. And it's been a gift indeed to be a part of these conversations as we represent such greatness in theological education at Hood. I'm particularly grateful to you all, to the president, certainly, and other administrators, professors, faculty, and especially to dear brother Trevor, who is a friend and colleague of mine from way back. So really grateful to be able to reconnect in this way. And also want to thank Kelly for getting us going here for the organizing of this evening's lecture. I bring you indeed greetings in the name of Jesus Christ from the lovely state of North Carolina. I am now a wonderful director of the Food, Health, and Ecological Wellbeing Center here at Wake Forest School of Divinity in Winston-Salem. I also serve as a professor of Black Feminist and Womanist Theologies here at Wake Forest School of Divinity, jointly appointed with African American Studies. Before this, many of you all know that I was here, Dr. Grant and others, with TCU, Texas Christian University, and so have spent the majority of my service in the work of ecological justice in the South. And very, very grateful to be able to bring you some reflections on eco-womanism on tonight, and also some reflections on where the work goes from here in terms of ecological reparations. I have been given the wonderful opportunity of sharing more conversation with you. And so I will actually limit most of my comments on tonight to about 30 minutes with the hope of being able to have really solid Q&A with you for the rest of the remaining hour, and then to join you again on tomorrow. Again, many different deep thanks to all those who have worked so deeply with the Speaks Lectureship. I realize it is very important to be able to lift up these particular lecture series, especially now, and to be able to transfer all of the wisdom and knowledge that we bring as spiritual leaders and as faith leaders online. So I'm very grateful for the flexibility that you all have offered me, and then also you are offering each other and the entire institution there. Let me indeed take advantage of the gift of virtual and connecting virtually and see if I can share screen. That will give us a chance to ruminate on these particular subjects together. Very good. If I can just get a thumbs up if you can see that screen. Wonderful. Thank you. The conversation that we will begin actually in this lecture series is really a conversation around the meeting points of ecological reparations and eco-womanism. Here we actually have a beautiful image of ritual that is being conducted by many spiritual guides and faith leaders in terms of really recognizing that the blood of our people is wrapped into the soil indeed of the earth. the soil indeed under many trees. And in this particular space, in this particular image, under the tree, which was known as a lynching tree. When we recognize that African Americans particularly have a specific entree into the work of environmental justice, we recognize that some of that entry into the conversation is both triumphant and is also filled with terror, what Kimberly E. Ruffin entitles the burden to beauty paradox, whereby we really have to consider that when the African American people consider social justice, racial justice, gender justice, and especially environmental justice, we are often coming to the movement with different questions and with different commitments. By working with this paradigm, the beauty to burden paradigm, but also looking at the realities of our connections to the soil, the very blood of African peoples in the soil, we actually have to contend with all the theological reflection necessary when we think about recovering the relationship of Black peoples to the earth. That means looking at lynching, looking at spaces of eco-memory that are not very comfortable for us, and also taking a huge step to consider that earth justice requires ecological reparations. Ecological reparations, not only racial reparations to the human beings who carry the blood and the soil and sweat and tears and prayers of African peoples, but also the deep, deep reparations that we must actually do to the people and the earth. Let me begin actually by walking through a little bit here in terms of where we go from here, looking at just a moment of meditation. I typically begin presentation with a 20-minute moment, or 2-minute moment rather, to be able to consider what does it mean that we've been given the opportunity to think, to be, to reflect, to be theological. And how do we actually deepen in the moment to do that? For many of my students, the gift of prayer has been introduced to them very, very early, but not always as a part of their classroom experience, or not always as a part of the kind of wrestling with their theological questions. Here, I invite us to take just a contemplative moment in keeping with the great traditions of extraordinary Christian mystics, Howard Thurman, to consider that as we are engaging prayer in a spiritual space, we are also engaging the thinking mind. Here now a passage, a contemplative reading from The Growing Edge by Howard Thurman. All around us, worlds are dying and new worlds are being born. All around us, life is dying and life is being born. The fruit ripens on the tree, the roots are silently at work in the darkness of the earth against the time when there shall be new lives, fresh blossoms, green fruit. Such is the growing edge. It is the extra breath from the exhausted lung, the one more thing to try when all else has failed, the upward reach of life when weariness closes in upon all endeavor. This is the basis of hope in moments of despair, the incentive to carry on when times are out of joint and men, people, have lost their reason, the source of confidence when worlds crash and dreams whiten into ash. The birth of a child, life's most dramatic answer to death. This is the growing edge incarnate. Look well to the growing edge. In this moment, in this part of the diaspora, in this part of the world where we are moving into a new season, the season of autumn, it is very common for those of us to begin to think about slowing the pace down. In the academic world, October happens to be one of the busiest months in the semester, but it is on the way towards mid-semester. It is on the way towards the end of the semester and a time of hope and renewal for all in education. One of the gifts I think that Howard Thurman gives us is not just the words that he's written here and reminding us that this too is the call of the life of the mind, that this too is the call of those of us who consider our work spiritual and deeply connected, heart, body, soul, and mind. But that this too is a time of reflecting in depth in terms of our own connection with the earth. When we consider the eco-literary voice of Howard Thurman, what we see here are a number of different agricultural or nature images. Immediately upon coming in to the stanza, we see fruit ripening on the tree, roots consistently at work, the darkness of earth. Howard Thurman was certainly brilliant in his way of being able to open the mind and open the heart to thinking deeply, but it is significant, I think, for African American and certainly Black religion to consider that as an eco-literary writer, he always wove in to his theological reflection a deep connection with the earth. While we know Howard Thurman to be a Christian mystic and deeply, deeply webbed into the work of theological education from the better part of the 20th century, we do also know that it is his hope, his ability, his presence that made such a deep impact on Martin Luther King and so many civil rights activists as a mentor and as a friend. To be able to mentor someone in a way that invites them to slow down and to stretch, and to do so by seeing and honoring a connection to earth is an important model, not just for eco-womanism, but for all of the study of religion. In thinking through the subject matter for today, blood in the soil, facing lynching, ecological reparations, and eco-womanism, I am often struck by the elements and the canon from which eco-womanism comes. That canon certainly being the work of Alice Walker and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Color Purple, and also a nonfiction writer of a number of different nature essays, but also the work of Toni Morrison, also the work of Maya Angelou, and almost every Black literary artist who has ever uncovered a connection to the earth. This canon also includes artists and singers and activists, such as the activists of Billie Holiday. Many of us are familiar with her powerful voice and singing the song Strange Fruit, a protest song to the hundreds, thousands of lynchings that were taking place in her time. When we consider trying to repair or understand what ecological reparations actually is, it is helpful to use Billie Holiday's voice as a way to enter the conversation. Now, this is significant in that we are lifting up the voice of a Black woman. This voice is not often the canonized voice, the dominant voice in the study of theology or religion. So in doing so, we are taking a huge step, a first methodological step of eco-womanism and certainly of womanist theology, that is to lift up the voice or to honor the experience, particularly of women of African descent. By starting with Billie Holiday, we are starting with an artist. We are starting with an activist, not necessarily starting with a theologian, biblical scholar, or ethicist. So that the epistemology and the knowledge that comes out of her voice is indeed deeply reflective of the voices of people of color. As we move through the ecological method that you may in fact be familiar with, we have to move from honoring experience to the second step of reflecting on that experience. Here we must reflect on the challenge to think about ecological reparations in the reality of lynching. This image of two African-American men being lynched in 1930. As many images of lynching, we must contend with the fact that there are smiles among those who are in the white mob, that there are Christians, many of them churchgoers, church leaders, and in some ministers of the faith in the white mob. We must also contend with the fact that the bodies of these Black men hanging from the tree are deeply connected parts of the earth, whereby we might imagine, being the eye of God on this scene, we could consider ourselves theologians, reflecting on the relationships, not just of the white mob and the descendants of the white mob, but also the descendants of those Black men who were lynched. And not just here. When we consider seriously ecological reparations, we must also ask the question, what repair must be done between the white supremacist framework in the white mob to use the tree and the repair necessary in the relationship between those who were lynched and the tree itself? I want to offer a definition of ecological reparations in that it might be helpful as we move forward in our conversation. Ecological reparations can be defined as the work and movement to shape environmental policy and theology that is reparative, restorative, and inclusive of the Earth's voice, and that shows compassion for all beings. Ecological reparations demands justice first. Now, those of us who are deeply familiar with Black liberation theology and certainly womanist thought know that justice is a primary tenet for womanist thought and womanist ethics primarily, and also a primary thought, virtue really in Black liberation theology, ethics, biblical hermeneutics, etc. To see it here then woven into ecological reparation should not be surprising. What may be surprising though is this inclusion of the Earth's voice, in the same way that we are radically including an activist, Billie Holiday's voice as a Black woman. We are also pushing here to include the Earth's voice, the voice of water, the voice of air, the voice of fire, energy, the voice of all of nature. Now, this is a far cry from a call to save the polar bears. This is a cry to actually hear the realities of climate change and how they are screaming out for our attention. When we consider the tree itself, and particularly the relationship between the tree and African Americans or the descendants of African enslaved peoples, the work of James Cone comes to mind as being primary in us thinking theologically about ways into doing or practicing ecological reparations. Here, a quote from James Cone, from The Cross and the Lynching Tree. The cross can heal and hurt. It can be empowering and liberating, but also enslaving and oppressive. There is no one way in which the cross can be interpreted. I offer my reflections because I believe that the cross placed alongside the lynching tree can help us to see Jesus in America in a new light, and thereby empower people who claim to follow him to take a stand against white supremacy and every kind of injustice. James H. Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Now, many of us knew Dr. Cone. I certainly studied with him at Union Theological Seminary, and you know that from the arc of his beginnings, all the way to the end of his life journey, that his understanding of inclusiveness and justice for all changed over time, beginning indeed in the beginning of the civil rights and in 1968 with the explosion of Black liberation theology. It is the case that he wrote primarily from a particular social location as a Black male. He wrestled with womanist students and scholars as they became scholars and began to ask the question of gender and where do women's voices present themselves as a part of the movement of Black liberation theology. Many know the story of Katie Cannon and Dolores Williams and Jacqueline Grant as they wrestled with James Cone as a professor and then also as a brother and colleague to help him understand the importance of not just looking at race as a critical category of analysis, but also gender and so much more. In the end, we find that Cone not only used racial justice as a way into doing theological reflection, but became a strong advocate for gender justice, sexual justice, earth orientation, and as we know it, earth justice, suggesting very early in such essays as in the Earth Habitat, whose earth is it anyway, that white supremacy is not just bad for people of color, it is disastrous for the earth. The logic of domination embedded in white supremacy is what he will call evil. And the white supremacy that we see aligned with Christianity, he would call not of God. This boldness of James Cone is a part of the boldness that we must wrestle with in thinking about ecological reparations. Justice for who, whom, and is the earth included in that form of justice? I want to pause here and just invite us into a moment of reflection before moving forward and certainly deepening into the method of eco-womanism. Many are very familiar with the text and the book, but also find that the practicing of the eco-womanist method can be helpful, particularly in classroom settings. The definition of eco-womanism, it is an approach to earth justice that centers the theological voices, ethical perspectives, multi-layered analysis, and experiences of women of color, specifically African-American women. Now, let me hasten to say that the work of eco-womanism as a field of study has already expanded. It was expanding before I wrote about it, and it was certainly expanding upon me coming into voice about claiming eco-womanism and using it formally as a name. I celebrate the work of Sophia Bannincourt, whose work in expanding eco-womanism really crosses beyond the boundaries of African-American identity and into transnational and transcultural, particularly looking at and lifting up the powerful work of Black or African Caribbean women. African indigenous religious traditions spread throughout the entire diaspora. Here, I really do appreciate Dr. Sophia's work, and because she pushes eco-womanism to not be siloed, but to be serious about engaging not just the impact of white supremacy in the North American context, but the impact of white supremacy on the entire earth. One of the other spaces of eco-womanism is that it does open the conversation beyond Christianity. It is the case that eco-womanism does share dialogue with a number of different religious traditions, in part because peoples of African descent in the North American context brought and still practice a variety of different religious traditions and spiritualities. To ignore African indigenous religious traditions and the impact the experiences and the connection with the earth is not in keeping with what we could do with ecological reparations. Therefore, eco-womanism is highly inclusive of interfaith perspectives, of interfaith dialogue, and reflections on interreligious comparative religion. Let me pause here and invite any questions that you may have. I do know that we want to offer at least 30 minutes for questions and answers in this evening. Thank you indeed for your attention.
Dr. Harris, I have a question at this time, if it's appropriate for me to ask.
Go right ahead. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Just considering the climate of academia and just religion in general, I was curious, do you ever find opposition from those in the faith-based or Christian-based, especially when you bring up the earth? Oftentimes we do find a degree of, I would say, closed-mindedness, if you will. And so I'm just curious, do you find opposition from within faith-based organizations? And if you do, how do you combat that?
It's a good question. Thank you. I think that the opposition comes from a variety of different spaces, oftentimes. Some of it is opposition from a kind of theological space, in part because of the embeddedness of a binary or dualistic understanding that is a part of the inheritance of Christianity. In African American spirituals, for example, we have this very important and sacred tradition of slave songs that really do bifurcate heaven and earth from each other. And therefore, there is an argument that can be made that the focus really needs to be on keeping those two spaces apart in one's theological imagination. That is to say, there is an argument that theologically, that whatever happens on the earth is actually going to dissolve and disappear anyway. And so we do not need to care about the planet. And what we really ought to be doing is focusing on heaven. Now, I have to admit, there is a good argument there, and there are a number of different resources and practices within Black religion that stand by and certainly support that way of thinking. I think particularly with faith communities of color, when that opposition or other points of opposition come about, what we're often confronted with is the reality of injustice in our communities. So Flint, Michigan, for example, or instances of environmental racism are often the pinpoints of what bring people of faith together in the first place. It is from that point then that oftentimes any opposition theologically that may have come about from a particular perspective has to take a back seat to the fact that there are Black people dying in our neighborhoods because of what it is in the water. And oftentimes the opposition then is reframed so as to focus on how to create wholeness and healing for Black people. I would say that there are lots of different points of opposition, certainly in the academy, to religion and ecology, but I think that is actually changing, and we've probably seen a huge shift, I think, in the past 15 to 20 years, in part because of the importance of climate change. There are lots of different politicalizations, around climate change, and lots of different political perspectives, and some of those fall out in terms of religious lines or theological lines or boundaries. But mostly in this moment, historically, there is a heightened awareness around climate change. Many of us living today, may look at the weather already in this October as different. Many spaces in the South, for example, are expected to have a mild winter. Well, there's a reason for that. And so oftentimes, even these kind of spaces in the academy who may oppose any talk of religion and ecology have to actually recognize that the earth feels different. It is hotter to live here than it was even 15, 20, 30 years ago. Thanks for your question.
Oh, thank you so much for your thorough response. Yes, ma'am, I do appreciate it.
Dr. Harris, Virgil Lattimore, I came up in education during the 70s, and I remembered the song Marvin Gaye sang, What's Going On, but he starts the lyrics, Mother, Mother, there's far too many of you crying. And I find that a wonderful connection as I've done workshops and have shared that about the whole issue of grief and, suffering, and also the environment. He goes on in that album to talk about the earth and why things are being polluted and the sky, the all of the issues happening with the air and so forth. So I think there's a great connection there.
Yes, thank you so much for lifting his voice. Indeed, such a powerful prophet, right? in his time, and certainly a powerful prophet that continues to speak to us, not just about environmental justice, but particularly around, as you mentioned, grief. I think that I appreciate your point in part because in these particular days, I'm sure, like you, many of our students, many of ourselves as ministers, many of our faith communities are wrestling with grief in a new way because of the COVID pandemic. And I do believe that it's kind of prophetic words like this, songs like this, that allow us to recognize that grief and dealing with grief has always been a part of the history, particularly of Black religion. It is the case that many people are afraid of grief and have a particular approach of shutting it out and shutting it down, which I think is one of the reasons why what you're saying is really important, to find these voices, to find different ways of actually bringing in the kind of comfortable way of addressing grief, to suggest that actually there is a way to grieve and that people have been grieving for a long time. What's important, I think, too, in what you've just shared, and I really do appreciate that, is that there is a part of climate violence that we are always grieving, and that we must find courage to grieve that and theological latitude to be able to grieve in the same way that many peoples and communities of African descent have been grieving, since 2015 and much before that, in terms of the awareness of Black life. So thank you again. That's a really powerful reminder. I think we have more wisdom around us than we realize. Other questions?
Dr. Harris, thank you. What was the catalyst that led you into this powerful work?
Great question. Really good question. My first book was on Alice Walker, Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics. And I had the honor of being able to work alongside her and also to study her work with great giants such as Vincent Harding and many Rosemary Harding and many other powerful Black minds and teachers and scholars and practitioners. I think it was recognizing how important earth justice was to Alice Walker. Here is a spiritual being who, wrote extensively, wrote, particular movies that are classic understandings of the way that we understand ourselves in Black culture, The Color Purple, Oprah Winfrey, et cetera, et cetera. And it was significant to me that both the character of Celie, who found so much liberation in being with the earth, was also a reality for many Black people and many Black women, that when Black women did struggle with sexism in the church, when there were certain ecclesiastical doors kind of shut down in their face, They found solace in singing and being with the earth and being outside and being together and being and creating church community in alternative ways. In some of these instances, we do find that some of these Black women are powerful ecological leaders. Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, Rosemary Harding, Iva Carruthers. I mean, these are powerful women who have been and are great, great minds, activists, theologians, but they have also been able to craft a way of being connected with the earth in ways that help to sustain them and their communities. This to me was very interesting, to take a deeper look and to begin to problematize the assumptions that I had that environmental justice was actually not a part of the Black church agenda, when in fact the entire environmental justice movement in the United States anyway really did start with the Black church. Thanks, Cindy, for your question.
Dr. Harris, this is David Gilchrist again. I do have one more question, if that's all right.
Go right ahead.
As pastors and leaders of local church organizations, do you have any recommendations how we can make an impact on the ground level? I do understand a lot of time there's tiers. There's that top level where things are very public, but what can be done on that local church level or local organizational level to help affect change?
It's a good question. Thank you for raising it. I honor those who are pastoring now more than ever, in part because of all of the different challenges that COVID has presented, how to sustain and maintain a community. I do feel, especially in the pandemic, but as we are, finding our way in the midst this far into it, is that this is actually a good time to lean in to helping churches to connect with and parishioners to connect with any connection that they may have with the earth. And this is where eco-womanism is particularly helpful, because the method is so easy to move into. It's a 7-step method. And it really begins with honoring your experience with nature. For some of us, that means thinking about grandmother's hands, shucking peas, or aunties, having good time on the patio as they were doing the work of creating peach cobbler, and as we were doing the work of actually feeding our families and our communities. Those, what I call eco memories, are central to remember as we begin to understand what makes us strong as a people of faith. Oftentimes, there is a deep remnant of some connection and reverence to the earth, reverence to the tree that produced the fruit, reverence to wheat, or some kind of knowledge. And as we actually look more deeply into our own herstory, our own history, our own eco-memory, we do recall the energy and the faith of grandfathers and grandmothers and great aunts and neighbors and friends and old deacons who held the church together because they had a connection with farming or the earth or nature. Oftentimes I find that when you give faith communities and specifically parishioners a chance to name their own earth story, they begin then to be able to make the connections about why it is important to uncover these stories and uncover their own connection with the earth. I think the second thing, obviously, is to invite parishioners to be with the earth. And I think particularly because of COVID, so many of our church spaces have had to go outdoors and meet outside. And this is, it has been particularly refreshing in some cases, especially during some of the cooler summer days, and certainly in the spring. It is significant that many Hush Harbor movements and the history of the Black church met outside. There is a way in which we are being able to recapture some of the holiness and sacredness of earth communion in our communities when we are outside. It's different when you don't have to worry about a microphone and when you don't have to worry about all these things right on the inside. We don't have to worry about people's chewing gum and programs and so forth. You can actually enjoy the earth and the song that God is singing as a part of the worship service. I have encountered more parishioners, I think, during the pandemic who have actually been able to settle into a deep connection with God and hearing from God, in part because they were invited to worship outside. So these are two examples, certainly getting involved with Green Faith and other organizations where you can do a kind of eco audit of your own church space. That's a wonderful opportunity. And there are lots of different organizations, certainly getting involved in educating church members about policies around climate change and the kind of ways and actions. And then I think probably, helping parishioners name what ecological or environmental injustices may actually be impacting other parishioners or themselves in the church. That's significant in part because it often can blend with a lot of activism that most of our Black churches are invited to do or are doing, in part because of our commitment to racial justice, writing one's council person, encouraging people to run for council, city council, et cetera. Those kinds of things are policy related, but certainly and politically related. But a lot of those kinds of movements and conversations actually start in the Black church and have deep connections to how we feel or think about the earth. I think the other final thing I'll say on that question, it's a great one, is and you'll see this in the method of eco-womanism, is to begin to critically analyze, some of the songs, some of the hymns that we do, some of the biblical scriptures that we do. Oftentimes when I present on eco-womanism, I'll lift up the Genesis stories about the creation and the creation narrative, but also lift up James Weldon Johnson's work and God's Trombones and the creation story. And in many, many Black church spaces, we understand that Black narrative about creation and our relationship with the earth is as theologically important as a reading of Genesis. That is to say that the livelihood and the spirituality of Black faith has shown up and does show up in the way that we think about our connection with the earth and our stewardship of the earth. That's important. That's an important root of Black liberation thought and certainly an important root of eco-womanism. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for your feedback.
Other questions?
Dr. Harris, Sharon Grant here. Thank you again for your wonderful presentation. Could you say some more about nature as witness in your work as we connect ecological reparation and creation justice?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Grant. It's important, I think, particularly in this conversation around ecological reparations, when we think about the connection between the tree and the descendants of those who were lynched, and also the relationship between the tree and those who are descendants of the white mob. In part because when we take that kind of step back to consider what God sees, what we also have to consider is that the tree witnessed the lynching differently than the white mob. The only narrative typically that we have, and even as viewers of an image such as the one we've seen in the presentation, is typically the narrative of the white mob. And that narrative essentially screams that white supremacy is the ruler of all and will always be. But when we take the perspective of the tree, or as I've talked about here, listen to Earth's voice, then we actually do bring about this different understanding of what does it mean to be witnessed and what does it mean to witness. There is a dual view that we see when we see from the perspective of the tree onto racial injustice or climate injustice. And the other side of that view is now our outside view onto what is happening to the tree. What both of those views see is the repetitive nature of violence. How do we as Christians justify that? We can't. And so here we actually have this opening into the conversation about once you have witnessed something, you can't unsee it. What does it mean then to take accountability for what your eyes have seen? To be accountable to the work of justice and really trying to create or to repair. And in that sense, the kind of tree as witness or ourselves as witness of climate violence, we actually are invited and not just invited, we're already there in doing the work of ecological reparations, because for many people, seeing an image of a lynched body is still jarring. It's still violent. It's still traumatic. And I think that for more and more people who have heightened awareness around what they're seeing and what we're seeing with climate change and certainly climate injustice, they are also alarmed. And that's important. Those alarm bells are really, really important. Thanks for that question, Dr. Grant.
Thank you.
Dr. Harris, this is Dr. Boyd. I just wanted to ask a small, first of all, thank you for this. This is great. But I wanted to ask a question when you started out with Billie Holiday, and was her song Strange Fruit a kind of witness for the trees?
Ah, good. Thank you, Dr. Boyd. That's brilliant. Yes, yes, I think it was. And I think there are so many other, voices that continue to be witness for the trees. I think that even as a, scholar of Black history, I didn't come to Strange Fruit thinking it that way, thinking about that environmental layer. As you name it, though, absolutely. And for me, it's significant that it was a woman who could see the tree and actually begin to bring voice to the tree, to the tree's misery. I think we see that same echo certainly in Seeley, in The Color Purple. We see that as a phenomenal mark of Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston. I mean, the entire Black women's literary tradition is filled with these extraordinary images of being able to see nature. So the question then, as a scholar is, what is it that is so unique in the bluest eye? What is it that is so unique in the Black woman's eye that can actually see nature? And I would say, just having been so deeply influenced by so many powerful, healthy Black male, scholars and teachers and parishioners and also pastors, I would say that the Black male Howard Thurman is able to see that too, and is able to be a witness to that too. I think where the analytical voice of eco-womanism is helpful is that there is something inherent in the domination that we see in male privilege, for example, that actually inhibits sight. It inhibits one's ability to see people, to see women, to see children, to see Earth. And I think that the more we can identify and be honest about the kind of privilege points that we have and how they blind us from being able to see, I think the better for our communities, but certainly the better for the Earth. Thank you. Great question. Thank you so much. And observation. Appreciate that.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. This is Dora Mboesangu here, and I'm wondering about the connection of motherhood and nurturing, and then seeing, because for me, whether a person is as old as they can be, a mother always looks at them as their child. And the idea of womanist women looking at lynching and seeing those hang on the tree and connecting them to their womb. And I'm talking about this because of the experience I've just had in my family, where one of my relatives had a premature baby who then died. And the pain of coming home holding nothing. And when they have been carrying a baby, carrying this and with the whole, all of the hopes, and then this whole idea of nurturing the womb, and then the lynching that affects, I don't know what, I will say this boldly, but with humbleness, that affects women more than I think it affects men. Because we, women, will be carrying the suffering of their children, the suffering of their, because they have that connection from the womb and from the soil, and this whole thing of looking at Mother Earth in connection with women. So I would like you to just talk a little bit more about that, because I think you are talking about that in some ways.
Thank you so much. It's a beautiful reflection, and thank you for sharing. Our thoughts and prayers are definitely with your family as they move through loss. It is significant that you bring up motherhood, and it's important to recognize that womanism, certainly eco-womanism, but womanism itself really came out of three genres, three kind of camps. Glenora Hudson Weems was one person who was also using the term womanist around the same time that Alice Walker was kind of coming up with the term. And then it's significant that there are many African theologians who were also looking at motherhood as a primary theme in womanism. And we don't actually see that work, that theme of motherhood, in many traditional womanist, womanist scholarship. KDG Cannon, we don't see it lifted up as much there. Even Jacqueline Grant, we don't see motherhood lifted up as much there. We do see it, of course, in the work of Dolores Williams, and certainly in the work of Layli McPyron. But there is something significant about the kind of African virtue of motherhood that we don't always see from scholars of African American kind of heritage. Now, I say that and also, put that in a larger conversation of the academy and of what is deemed as proper scholarship. And women generally in the North American context have had to always fight to be fully embodied. And a part of their embodiment is often considered their ability to mother. I think so that's one of the reasons why I think that there's just so few kind of womanist voices on motherhood and the lifting up of that virtue. So it's important to uncover some of the kind of scholarly context of the point that you're addressing. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I do think, along with many Latin American ecofeminists, I agree with Yvonne Guevara. I agree with so many Indian really powerful traditional healers that women do have a different perspective. We do have a different connection with the earth. I have to say that in work, I have a son, and in working with mothers of sons and working more around the nurturing of healthy Black masculinity primarily, I do believe that it is possible and that it is probably very natural for men to have a deep connection with the earth. It's just work. to undo the socialization that they should not be connected to anything natural. That is not to say that a man can bear a child in the same way that a woman can, but it is to say that it is more in keeping with a womanist ideology and a womanist thought than it might be of feminism to be always inclusive of Black men and Black sons and Black brothers and uncles and fathers. That being said, yes, I believe that you are right, that there is something significant about the womb, that space that a mother can hold for a child and the connection that that womb space creates when that womb space is empty or violated, is when we actually do have to take note about the different ways of creating grief and grief spaces, not just that the individual has to go through alone, but to really, really focus on the community support and the community going through the grieving process along them. The essay that comes directly to mind in thinking about your reflection is the work of Dolores Williams, Sin, Nature and Black Women's Bodies, whereby she makes a really important comparison between the womb of a mountain and the womb of an enslaved Black woman, literally being taken out, destroyed in the case of the mountain for the sake of coal, in the case of the enslaved Black woman for the process of creating additional slaves, to the point of, you know, enabling, not being able to reproduce. That's a little different than the example that you brought to us this evening, but yes, there's a lot there. I think that that is a space that you've named that would certainly be another locus point for repairing, and certainly reparation. So the question would be, how do you not just repair an empty womb in the community that, you know, is missing that child, but also how do you repair any sense of, or any experience of the lack of health or the lack of health care. And many people of African descent experience this, particularly in the United States, but I think globally, because our rates of infant mortality are so high, so very high. And so it becomes a larger question around policy, around healthcare and environmental care, around gender care. It becomes a larger question about what are we doing and how are we maintaining some sense of accountability to the mother who does not have a child, as well as the mother who does.
Dr. Harris, I'm going to have to interrupt a second because it is 8 o'clock and students are going to have to transition to their next class. But great to see you. Thank you so much for a wonderful first lecture. As expected, you've generated rich conversation that we're all going to sleep on. And we look forward to 11 a.m. tomorrow when you deliver the second of the Bishop Speaks lectures. And so on behalf of the community, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's been our great honor.
Thank you. So deeply honored to be here with you all. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, blessed night. We'll see you in the morning. Thank you again for the invitation.